They crowned her in gold, yet she walked with the weight of 1,000 years in her eyes. Tonight we will live a life in the shadow of the last queen of the Nile, where the river's breath carries the scent of jasmine and the hush of secrets that have slept for centuries. Cleopatra, daughter of dynasties and keeper of Egypt's fading crown, was not merely a beauty draped in silk, but a mind sharper than the obsidian blades that guarded her throne. Her life unfolded beneath columns kissed by the sun, and within chambers veiled in incense, where decisions were made that could tilt the fate of empires. She was the last ember of a kingdom older than Rome itself, a living echo of the gods her people once worshipped. Beneath her touch, history bent, and in her gaze, the ancient world took its final breath. Leave your whisper in the comments. And if this story speaks to you, light a candle with a like. Now, get comfortable. The past is waiting. The Nile moved like liquid bronze beneath the morning sun, a slow and patient artery that had carried the lifeblood of Egypt for thousands of years. It was here, in the city of Alexandria, where marble colonnades rose from the dust and the air, shimmered with the salt of the Mediterranean, that Cleopatra's first breath was drawn. She was born into a house where voices echoed in Greek, where scrolls from distant lands lined cedar shelves, and where politics was not an art but a weapon. The Ptolemaic dynasty, her bloodline, had ruled Egypt for centuries since the time of Alexander's generals, yet they were Greeks on Egyptian soil, monarchs draped in the rituals of a land they did not descend from. Cleopatra would be the first in generations to speak the native tongue of her people, to walk among them not as a distant figurehead, but as a presence they could claim as their own. From the moment she opened her eyes, the fate of Egypt curled, itself around her like smoke. The palace was not a place of safety, but a stage of constant performance, where brothers and sisters were rivals and uncles could be executioners. Power was the Nile's current, carrying those bold enough to ride it and drowning those who stumbled. Even as a child, Cleopatra would have felt its pull, seen the sharp edges beneath the glitter. In the gardens where date palms cast soft shadows on limestone paths, she would have heard the whispers of servants, the murmurs of court advisors, and the cold, polished tones of ambassadors from Rome, whose presence grew heavier with each passing year. Alexandria was unlike any city in the world. It was the meeting place of civilizations, where Egyptian temples stood alongside Greek theaters, where traders from India sold spices under the gaze of statues carved in the likeness of gods who had long ceased to be worshipped elsewhere. At the heart of the city rose the great library, a labyrinth of knowledge where words were treasures more valuable than gold. Cleopatra would grow to walk among those scrolls, her fingers grazing the fragile papyrus, her eyes devouring histories and philosophies, laws and love poems. The scent of ink and parchment was as familiar to her as the perfume of blue lotus. Knowledge was her inheritance as much as the throne, and she understood even then that a ruler's mind could be a sharper weapon than an army's blade, but the throne was never hers alone. The Ptolemaic tradition was one of shared rule, often between siblings, and as she came of age, Cleopatra was bound to the fate of her younger brother Ptolemy, 13. He was a boy easily swayed by courtiers who feared her growing influence. It was the nature of dynasties to pit blood against blood, and Egypt's royal family was no exception. The tension was a shadow in every feast, every council meeting, every flicker of the oil lamps that lit the palace halls. The air in Alexandria tasted faintly of both honey and ash, sweetness and danger woven together. The Rome of this age was an insatiable force, stretching its fingers over the Mediterranean, binding kingdoms in invisible chains. Egypt was wealthy, its grain and gold, irresistible to the empire's hunger. Cleopatra knew this as she watched Roman envoys move through the palace, their eyes calculating, their hands resting on the hilts of their short swords. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had learned to balance Rome's friendship with Egypt's independence. But such a balance was as fragile as glass. When he died, the thin thread holding peace together frayed, and the palace became a crucible of power. Cleopatra's rise to sole authority was neither clean nor merciful. Forced into exile by her brothers, advisors, she fled into the desert, the sands burning beneath her feet, the horizon stretching like an endless trial. Yet the desert was not a place of defeat. It was there, in the harsh silence, where the wind whispered over dunes, that Cleopatra began to forge herself into the ruler history would remember. She gathered loyal followers, built alliances, and waited for the moment the Nile's current would turn in her favor. The desert stars, cold and sharp, watched her without blinking. That moment came when Rome itself was torn between two giants, Julius Caesar and Pompey. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, seeking to settle Egypt's civil war in Rome's favor, Cleopatra saw not just a conqueror, but an opportunity. She did not approach him with armies or threats, but with the calculated grace of someone who understood that persuasion could be more potent than steel. The story would be told for centuries, how she crossed the city hidden within a rolled carpet, emerging not as a supplicant, but as a queen. Her presence as deliberate as the placement of a jewel. Yet this was not the tale of seduction Rome loved. To repeat, it was the story of survival, of a young woman standing at the edge of extinction and stepping forward with the mind of a strategist. Caesar recognized her intelligence, her vision for Egypt, and in his support she regained her throne. But the price was an invisible thread, binding Egypt ever closer to Rome. The marble steps of the palace felt colder beneath her feet, the shadows in the corridors longer. Even in victory, Cleopatra knew she was playing a game whose board stretched far beyond the Nile. The Nile itself mirrored her constant, yet ever-changing, nurturing, yet capable of drowning those who underestimated its depth. Its waters carried her name in their currents, whispering to the fields of papyrus, to the fishermen casting nets at dawn, to the traders whose ships leaned into the wind. She had returned to Alexandria not as a pawn, but as the Queen of Egypt, the living goddess, the last defender of a kingdom whose sands had seen the rise and fall of empires. And yet, somewhere in the quiet between the temple bells and the cry of gulls over the harbor, Cleopatra must have felt the weight of the years, to come pressing down like the unbroken gaze of the desert stars. The court of Alexandria, restored to her command, was a place of beauty layered over danger, like a rose whose petals concealed thorns of glass. Cleopatra moved through its corridors as both sovereign and sentinel, for the peace she had reclaimed was fragile, more illusion than truth. Rome's presence was no longer a whisper in the background. It was the pulse beneath every decision, the shadow behind every gilded column. Julius Caesar, her ally, her partner in politics and in life, remained in Egypt through the birth of their son Caesarion. The boy's name carried the weight of two worlds, Egypt and Rome entwined like the reeds and the river. Yet the very existence of this child was a provocation, a question whispered in the marble halls of the Roman Senate. Could Egypt's queen dream of binding Rome to her bloodline? Alexandria flourished under her renewed rule. The streets swelled with traders from Cyrene, Phoenicia, and distant India. their goods spilling colors and scents into the air. The temples were draped with offerings once more, priests chanting hymns to Isis as though the goddess herself had returned in mortal form. In the library, scholars bent over their scrolls by candlelight, recording the latest maps of the Red Sea, translating the poems of Sappho into Egyptian, calculating the movements of the stars. Cleopatra's patronage was both political and personal. Her mind was never far from the pursuit of knowledge. She surrounded herself with astronomers, philosophers, healers, for she understood that a ruler who controlled the flow of knowledge controlled the future. Yet the future was not hers alone to shape. In Rome, Caesar's rise was as dazzling as it was dangerous. His assassination in 44 BCE struck like a blade across the horizon. News reached Alexandria not as a mere event, but as a tide that could sweep away everything she had built. Caesarion, barely a child, was now the living reminder of a union that Rome's new leaders might see as threat rather than legacy. Mark, Antony, and Octavian, Caesar's chosen heirs in power, if not in blood, were men with ambitions as vast as the empire itself. Cleopatra watched them from a distance, reading their movements as though they were constellations whose patterns foretold storms. When Antony called for her, it was under the guise of alliance. The stage was set not in Egypt, but in Tarsus, where she sailed upriver to meet him upon a barge draped in purple sails, the air heavy with the perfume of incense, the oars striking the water in time with the music of flutes. It was a calculated vision, not to charm, but to declare. She arrived not as a supplicant, but as Isis come to life, surrounded by attendants dressed as cupbearers of the gods. Antony, soldier of Rome and heir to Caesar's cause, was a man who understood the language of spectacle, and he answered it with his own form of devotion. Their bond was forged not merely in attraction, but in the alignment of power and purpose. Together they imagined a world where Egypt would stand not beneath Rome's heel, but beside it as an equal. In the years that followed, they became partners in both governance and defiance, their lives entwining in ways that made them inseparable, to friend and foe alike. Children were born of their union, and in their names Cleopatra saw a continuation of dynasties, a future she fought to claim against the tightening grip of Rome's politics. But Octavian, cold and deliberate as the northern wind, saw their alliance as a challenge to his vision of empire. His rhetoric in Rome painted Cleopatra as a seductress ensnaring Antony, as if reducing her to a caricature could diminish her influence. Yet even as the Senate whispered and Rome sharpened its knives, Cleopatra's court remained a beacon of wealth and culture. She expanded irrigation along the Nile, fortified Egypt's harbors, and maintained alliances with neighboring kingdoms. Still, the current was shifting. War between Antony and Octavian loomed, a storm gathering over the Mediterranean. Cleopatra, prepared not as a bystander, but as a queen whose kingdom's survival depended on the outcome. She outfitted fleets, gathered resources, and strengthened her ties with those still loyal. The sands of Egypt were warm beneath her feet, but the wind carried the scent of salt and iron, the foretelling of battle. The Nile, in its eternal patience, had seen such tides before. It had watched kings rise and crumble like the mud-brick walls of forgotten villages. Cleopatra knew she might soon join those ranks. Yet she moved forward with the same deliberate grace that had brought her from exile to power. She was no longer the girl of Alexandria's gardens, listening to whisper. She was the whisper itself, carried on the wind, impossible to silence. The Mediterranean lay wide and restless, its horizon a thin, trembling line between two destinies. It was upon these waters that the fate of Egypt would be tested. The year was 31 BCE, and Cleopatra's fleet, gilded and disciplined, sailed alongside Antony's legions toward the western coast of Greece. The Bay of Actium would become more than a battlefield. It would be a wound in history. Octavian's forces were relentless, their ships maneuvered with precision, their supply lines unbroken. Cleopatra commanded not from the safety of her palace, but from her flagship, its decks polished to a mirror sheen, its sails the color of deep wine, catching the sun like a beacon. The air before the battle was heavy with salt and omen. Gulls circled low, their cries sharp as knives. Soldiers tightened their grips on oars and spears, glancing toward their queen, whose eyes held the stillness of a statue and the calculation of a general. She had brought Egypt's wealth and her own person into the heart of a foreign war, because she knew that defeat for Antony would mean more than loss. It would mean Rome's chains around her country, her people, her children. The clash came in a thunder of ramming ships and the crack of timber, the screams of men swallowed by the roar of water. Flames licked at sails, smoke curled into the pale sky. In the chaos, Antony's formations broke, the plan unraveling like frayed rope. Cleopatra made the fateful choice to withdraw her fleet, preserving what could still be saved. Retreating toward Alexandria with the wind at her back but the weight of 1,000 accusations in her wake. History would debate that moment whether it was betrayal or strategy, but to Cleopatra it was the only move left on a board already tilting toward defeat. In the months that followed, Antony's cause withered. Octavian pursued them to Alexandria, the city's harbors filling with the tension of siege. Cleopatra prepared the palace for what she must have known could be her final stand. She ordered the construction of 2 great tombs, one for Antony, one for herself, not as monuments to death, but as declarations of identity. If Rome would take Egypt, it would not take their bodies as trophies. The days grew thick with dust and the smell of burning oil. Antony, wounded in both spirit and body, faltered beneath the weight of loss. Cleopatra remained at his side, her presence a reminder of the dream they had once shared, now collapsing like a temple struck by unseen tremors. Outside the palace, the Nile's waters flowed on, indifferent to the walls of men, carrying papyrus boats and the songs of fishermen, as they had for centuries. When the end came, it was swifter than the years that had led to it. Antony, believing Cleopatra dead, fell upon his own sword. She had him carried to her, his blood staining the silks where their hands met for the last time. In the echo of his breath, she must have felt the last thread of their alliance snap, leaving her alone in the narrowing corridor of history. Octavian entered Alexandria not as a conqueror in triumph, but as an executioner in waiting. Cleopatra was taken under guard, her fate left to the discretion of the man who now held the world in his grasp. She understood what awaited her in Roma parade through the streets. The last queen of Egypt displayed in chains, the memory of her reign reduced to spectacle. For a woman who had lived as a goddess, who had ruled as a sovereign, such an end was unthinkable. She chose instead the path of those who refused to be broken by their captors. In the quiet of her chamber, surrounded by the few loyal hands who remained, she prepared for her final act. The asp, coiled in a basket of figs, was not just a serpent, it was the embodiment of Egypt's sovereignty, the bite a seal upon her will. When the venom struck, It was with the inevitability of the Nile's flood. Her pulse slowed, her gaze fixed not on the walls around her, but on something far beyond. In that moment, Cleopatra passed from the realm of the living into the realm of legend, the last breath of pharaonic Egypt carried on the wind. The city mourned, the river carried her name, and the sands closed over the footprints of her reign. Yet the world, for all its shifting empires, would never truly forget the queen who had dared to stand against the tide. In the days after her death, Alexandria did not sleep. The air was heavy with the mingled sense of incense and seawater, as though the city itself grieved and the Mediterranean had sent its breath to mourn. Merchants along the Canopic Way closed, their stalls, their goods hidden beneath woven cloth. Priests lit candles in the shadow of temples whose walls bore hieroglyphs older than Rome, chants rising and falling like the tide. Those who had seen her carried through the palace one final time spoke in whispers of the serenity on her face, the way her fingers seemed to rest not in surrender but in possession, as though she still held the key to some secret door beyond. This life, Octavian ordered that Cleopatra be buried with Antony, honoring a final request that might have softened the cruelty of conquest in the eyes of history. Yet this gesture was not born entirely of mercy, it was a calculated preservation of dignity, for parading her lifeless form through Rome would have diminished his triumph. The tombs were sealed in stone, adorned with carvings of lotus and papyrus. The twin plants of Upper and Lower Egypt, bound together as they had been under her rule. In that union of symbols, her reign found its last silent statement, but death did not end her influence. Stories of Cleopatra spread like the currents beneath the Nile's surface unseen, unstoppable. In the markets of Cyprus, sailors told of her intellect and the way she spoke 9 languages. In the wine shops of Athens, philosophers debated her strategies, weighing her victories against her losses. In Rome, senators used her name as both a warning and a fascination, a reminder that power could be embodied not only in legions but in a single mind. Her life became a mirror in which every storyteller saw what they wished. Temptress, stateswoman, goddess, rebel. Alexandria itself changed under Rome's hand. The banners of the eagle replaced the double crown of Egypt, and the gold of the treasury flowed northward, grain ships sailing toward the hungry streets of the capital. The great library, still standing in those years, remained a sanctuary for scholars, though its collections now answered to new masters. The rhythm of the city did not break entirely, but its heartbeat slowed, its voice softened. Without a native ruler upon the throne, Egypt became less a kingdom and more a province, jewel-worn, not for its own beauty, but for the prestige it gave its possessor. Yet among the people, memory worked in ways empire could not touch. Fishermen along the Nile told their children of the queen who walked among them in disguise, who spoke their tongue and listened to their concerns. Farmers in the delta left offerings of bread and honey at shrines long abandoned by the state, whispering her name in the same breath as the goddess Isis. In the desert, caravans carried tales of her journeys, her knowledge of the stars, her ability to turn strangers into allies with the precision of a sculptor's chisel. These stories traveled farther than the boundaries of Egypt, weaving her presence into the imagination of lands she had never walked. The Roman historians, writing in their shaded courtyards, recorded her in the language of victors. They reduced her to her beauty, as if intellect and strategy could be overlooked when weighed against the curve of a cheek or the color of her eyes. They wrote of her liaisons with Caesar and Antony as though they were her sole achievements. Ignoring the years she ruled Egypt alone, stabilizing its economy, expanding its trade, and strengthening its borders. Time would inherit both the truth and the distortions, and it would be centuries before voices would rise to untangle one from the other. Cleopatra's tomb, hidden somewhere beneath the shifting sands or the ruins reclaimed by sea, became an obsession for seekers. Generations of rulers and explorers searched for it, drawn not merely by the promise of treasure, but by the hope of standing in the presence of the woman who had defied the greatest empire of her age. None found it. Perhaps the Nile itself claimed it, hiding her in the same way it hid the relics of older dynasties beneath its fertile banks. Perhaps she chose her resting place, knowing it would remain beyond reach, so that her story could live without the finality of discovery. For, in truth, what she left behind was not only stone or gold, but a legacy woven into the way the world understood power. She proved that sovereignty could be more than the command of armies. It could be the mastery of words, the reading of tides in both rivers and politics, the ability to see the map of the world, not as it was, but as it might become. In this, she was a ruler of both land and imagination, a queen whose borders extended into the realm of memory, and so the centuries turned, carrying her name across languages and continents. In the courts of medieval Europe, her story was retold. In illuminated manuscripts, her figure robed in fabrics unknown to her time, her face reshaped by the ideals of distant ages. In the palaces of the Islamic caliphates, poets wrote of her wisdom, placing her among the sages of history. In the halls of the Renaissance, artists painted her final moments, the asp at her breast, the light falling upon her like the benediction of an unseen sun. She became eternal not through preservation of her body, but through the endless retelling of her life. Yet somewhere, beneath layers of time, the true Cleopatra remains the woman who stood on the balcony of her palace at dawn, watching the Nile shimmer in the first light, knowing both its gift and its threat. The one who walked into exile with the certainty she would return, who placed her trust not in the promises of allies, but in the weight of her own will. That Cleopatra, unsoftened by legend, still waits in the quiet between history's pages, her voice carried in the rustle of papyrus, her gaze lingering in the reflection of the river she once ruled. The centuries that followed did not erase her name, but they shifted it like a stone carried downriver, smoothing some edges, sharpening others, until the woman became an emblem. Rome itself, which had claimed Egypt as a province, crumbled under the weight of its own empire. Yet in the minds of its poets and chroniclers, Cleopatra lived on, a shadow cast across their vision of the ancient world. They spoke of her with fascination, sometimes with warning, as if the idea of a woman holding such power unsettled the balance they wished to preserve. For them, she was both cautionary tale and glittering spectre, proof that beauty could command armies and intellect could bend kings. Asterisk in Egypt. Her memory lingered not as the Romans painted it, but as a quiet undercurrent in daily life. Farmers still sowed grain in the rhythms she had reinforced. Merchants traced their prosperity to the trade routes she had secured. Priests in crumbling temples still murmured prayers in her name when no Roman official was near. She had ruled not as a caretaker of a fading dynasty, but as one who sought to bind together a fractured realm, to give it breath in an age when great powers sought only to carve it apart. For the common people, she was not the queen of Rome's scandalous histories, but the last pharaoh who had stood for Egypt's own heart. Asterisk time, however, is a patient sculptor. As dynasties rose and fell, as new empires claimed the Nile's shores, the direct memories of her reign slipped into legend. The Arabs who came in the wake of Rome's collapse heard of her in fragments, folding her into their own histories. Of wise and cunning women, travelers from far-off lands, seeing the broken pillars of Alexandria, wove her into tales that were more dream than fact. Even the city itself began to forget the exact places where her footsteps had fallen. The palace where she had ruled sank into ruin, much of it claimed by the restless sea. The harbor's waters deepening over marble floors and gilded halls. Yet there were always those who searched. In the Middle Ages, scholars in Cairo whispered of a hidden chamber beneath the sands, where her sarcophagus lay surrounded by scrolls written in her own hand. They said the air inside was still scented with lotus and cedar, that a golden diadem rested beside her brow, untouched by time. Pilgrims came not for treasure, but for the hope of standing where she slept, of feeling the same air that it carried. Her last breath, none found her, though some returned claiming to have seen signs of a carved falcon in a ruin. A fragment of alabaster with a faint etching of a woman's profile, in Europe. As the Renaissance bloomed, she returned to life in the minds of artists and scholars. Painters cast her in rich crimson robes she had never worn, her skin pale in ways foreign to the Egyptian sun, her palace remade in the image of Florence or Venice. Playwrights shaped her into a figure of tragedy and grandeur, her life a stage, where love and power destroyed each other in a blaze of inevitability. These works traveled beyond courts into the minds of common folk, until Cleopatra became less a person than an idea vessel for whatever story the teller wished to pour into her. Still, through all the reshaping, the essence of her endured. The accounts that spoke of her command of languages, her grasp of politics, her negotiations with kingdoms from Nubia to Judea, these fragments resisted the erasures of time. Even when wrapped in the trappings of romanticism, the reality of her intellect could not be fully silenced. And for those who listened closely, the echoes of her true voice were still there. Beneath the gilded layers others had placed upon her. The land she had ruled also carried her mark. The canals she restored, the temples she repaired, the city she adorned with works of learning and beauty, these were not undone by the passing of dynasties. Alexandria remained a hub of knowledge long after her death, its scholars preserving not just Greek and Roman texts, but Egyptian wisdom that might otherwise have vanished. The patterns she had set in governance endured quietly, hidden in the bones of the land, invisible to those who did not know how to see them. And so, Cleopatra's life became something larger than its own span. She was the thread that tied together the fading age of pharaohs and the relentless tide of empire, the voice that refused to be muted even by centuries of retelling. For every Roman account that sought to diminish her, there was an Egyptian whisper that raised her up. For every painting that dressed her in foreign silks, there was the memory of the queen who walked the gardens of the Nile, speaking in the tongue of her people. She was claimed by many, owned by none. The desert, vast and unyielding, still guards her with the same patience it has given to the kings of older dynasties. Somewhere beneath its shifting face or in the quiet embrace of the sea, her resting place remains beyond reach, as if the land itself has conspired to keep her where no conqueror's hand can touch her. And perhaps this is her final triumph, not the battles won or lost, not the alliances made or broken, but the fact that her story belongs to no single victor, that she remains, even now, her own. The legacy of Cleopatra was not sealed in the marble of monuments or the pages of scrolls alone, but in the unseen fabric of culture, art, and identity that wove through the centuries. Her story, like the Nile itself, flowed through civilizations, carrying with it fragments of truth hidden beneath layers of myth and memory. It entered the whispered prayers of desert nomads, the lavish courts of Byzantine emperors, and the quiet scribbles of scholars copying ancient texts by candlelight. In every retelling, she was both the woman and the symbol, the eternal queen who commanded empires, who challenged the known world with a mind as sharp as the asp's bite. The transformation of Alexandria from a Hellenistic capital into a Roman city did not erase her influence. Rather, it refracted it. The city became a palimpsest, where her reign lingered beneath the surface like a secret melody. Temples once dedicated to Isis, which Cleopatra had revived with renewed fervor, were repurposed or hidden away, but the power of the goddess and the queen who embodied her did not fade. In the quiet courtyards, beneath arches carved with lotus and papyrus, the echoes of her reign persisted like a sacred hymn. Artisans centuries later sculpted busts that bore a resemblance to her visage, capturing a likeness not simply of form but of will. Painted manuscripts and tapestries from distant lands depicted scenes from her life, the meeting with Julius Caesar, the voyage on the barge to meet Antony, the final moments in her chamber embroidered with gold leaf and bathed in the glow of candlelight. Each artist poured their own reverence and fear into their work, aware that Cleopatra was more than a queen. She was an enigma wrapped in history's shadows. In libraries far from the Nile, her story became a bridge between East and West. Scholars in Alexandria's later iterations, monks in European monasteries, and scribes in the Islamic Golden Age all preserved the fragments of her life, translating her story into new languages, adapting it to new contexts. The Arabic name Kalb Shot echoed in marketplaces and courts, a softened echo of the name Cleopatra, reminding listeners of her wisdom and tenacity. The scholars debated her motives, her intellect, and the politics that had defined her rule, finding in her story lessons on power, diplomacy, and survival. The Renaissance breathed new life into Cleopatra's image, but this rebirth was both a blessing and a distortion. Writers and painters turned her into the tragic heroine, a woman caught between love and duty, empire and passion. Her beauty was celebrated endlessly, sometimes at the expense of the sharpness that had defined her reign. She was painted with pale skin and European features, draped in silks that had never graced her form. But the brilliance of her spirit could not be fully erased. This was a time when history and art intertwined, and Cleopatra became both muse and mirror figure in which societies projected their own hopes and anxieties about gender, power, and sovereignty. Still, beneath these layers, the real Cleopatra persisted, the queen who spoke to her people in their language, who managed vast resources, who negotiated with Rome and the kingdoms beyond, who understood the delicate dance of diplomacy as a survival art. She remained. The balance she maintained between the old gods and the new rulers, between tradition and innovation, was a testament to her skill as a sovereign. Alexandria, the city she had loved and shaped, continued to be a beacon of learning. Its streets, filled with merchants, scholars, and pilgrims drawn by the city's enduring spirit. Throughout history, poets found in Cleopatra's life a sacred rhythm, rise and fall that mirrored the cycles of the Nile, the waxing and waning of the moon, the eternal dance of life and death. Her name became a symbol of transformation, the embodiment of the fragile yet unyielding power that could change the course of nations. In her final act, choosing death on her own terms rather than captivity, she transcended the role imposed by conquerors and became legend. Asterisk, even today, Cleopatra's image remains a potent force. In museums, films, books, and the quiet corners of history, she is studied, debated, and reimagined. Each generation rediscovers her, seeking in her story the answers to questions of identity, power, and resilience. The Nile still flows, carrying her memory in its currents, a living thread connecting past and present. Asterisk, and in the stillness of the night, when the desert wind moves over forgotten ruins and the stars cast their cold light on silent stones, the whisper of Cleopatra can be heard not as a name written in history books, but as a voice calling out from the depths of time, asking to be understood anew. The night sky above Alexandria stretched wide and eternal, a canvas of frost and distant fires that had witnessed the unfolding of countless stories, yet none as intricate or as fraught as Cleopatra's. Beneath those stars, generations of Egyptians would look upward and wonder what the heavens had witnessed in that final century of the Ptolemaic reign, when a queen walked between gods and mortals. When empires clashed and destinies shifted like sand, her reign was more than a chapter in a history book. It was a living poem etched into the fabric of the city, in its stones, its river, and the hearts of its people. To understand Cleopatra, one must look beyond the grandeur of palaces and the glint of gold. She was a woman of paradoxes, both a daughter of Greek lineage and a ruler of an ancient Egyptian throne, both a scholar who devoured texts in multiple tongues and a sovereign whose presence commanded armies and diplomacy. Her identity was woven with threads from two worlds, never wholly belonging to either, yet embodying the spirit of both with unwavering certainty. This duality shaped her every choice, every alliance, every whispered strategy. Her intellect was not merely scholarly, but deeply practical. She studied the movements of Rome's political tides as closely as she observed the stars, recognizing patterns in chaos, discerning opportunity in upheaval. The political stage of the late Republic was a tempest, and Cleopatra was a navigator who knew the importance of both the steady hand and the daring sail. She understood that her survival and that of Egypt depended on alliances not born of whim but of mutual necessity, and she wielded charm and cunning alike as instruments of statecraft. Her life, too, was marked by ritual and symbolism, each act imbued with meaning. The voyages on the Nile were more than transportation. They were sacred processions that echoed the journeys of gods, affirming her role as Isis incarnate. The temples where she prayed were more than places of worship. They were stages where she enacted the continuity of tradition, even as she rewrote the rules of power. Her gestures, her words, and even her attire were deliberate, chosen to evoke the sacred and the temporal in a delicate balance. Yet beneath the weight of crown and empire, there was also a woman shaped by loss and longing, the betrayals within. Her own family, the exile to desert sands, the ever-present threat of Rome's expansion. These were shadows that followed her, silent but persistent. The deaths of loved ones, the uncertain futures of her children, and the knowledge that her reign might be the last breath of a fading dynasty must have carved quiet fissures in her soul. Her strength was born not from unbroken certainty, but from the resolve to move forward despite the fractures beneath. Alexandria, in those years, was a city alive with contradiction, hope and fear, splendor and decay, faith and skepticism. Markets buzzed with merchants trading silks and spices. Scholars debated in shaded courtyards. Priests performed rites that had endured for millennia. Cleopatra's presence was felt everywhere, from the bustling harbors where ships flew the banners of distant lands to the quiet chambers where she met with advisors, plotting courses that might save her kingdom. Her life was intertwined with the city's pulse, as inseparable as the Nile. From its banks, her final years were marked by the relentless advance of Rome and the collapse of old alliances. The Battle of Actium was not just a military defeat, but a symbolic fracture, a moment when the old world began to give way to the new. Yet even in retreat, Cleopatra maintained the dignity and resolve that had defined her reign. Her choice to end her life on her own terms, to refuse the humiliation of captivity, was a final assertion of sovereignty, a refusal to be rewritten by conquerors. Her death did not silence her voice, but transformed it into a lasting echo, reverberating through history and memory. She became a symbol of resistance, a figure who challenged the narratives imposed by empire and who embodied the complexities of power, gender, and identity. Her story invites us to look beyond the surface, to listen to the whispers beneath the stones and the currents beneath the river. And so, under the cold light of the stars and the gentle murmur of the Nile, Cleopatra's spirit endures both, as a memory carved in time and as a question that lingers, waiting to be answered anew. Time flows like the Nile, unceasing, patient, carrying with it the sediment of countless lives, memories, and dreams. Cleopatra's story, once living and breathing among the bustling streets of Alexandria and the hallowed halls of power, now rests beneath the layers of dust and history, but it is far from silent. Like the river's current that never forgets the path it has carved, her legacy weaves through the fabric of civilizations, whispered in forgotten tongues and echoed in the songs of distant lands. Her reign was the closing stanza of an ancient poem where the grandeur of Egypt's pharaohs met the relentless force of Rome's empire. She was the last in a long line, the final bearer of a crown that symbolized both divine right and mortal burden. The world she knew was changing. Empires rose and fell, gods were questioned and replaced, and the old rhythms of life began to shift beneath new stars. Yet she stood at the crossroads, a figure of immense will who sought to hold the past and future in her hands. Cleopatra's intellect and strategy extended beyond the battlefield and the throne room. She was a master of language and culture, fluent not only in Greek and Egyptian, but in the tongues of allies and rivals alike. This gift allowed her to negotiate the labyrinth of power with subtlety, turning enemies into friends, skeptics into allies. She understood that rule was not only about force, but about trust, symbolism, and the delicate dance of appearances. Her image was carefully crafted, a living icon shaped to inspire awe and loyalty, draped in fine linens dyed with the colors of the Nile's lotus, adorned with jewels that caught the sunlight like trapped stars. She moved through her court with the grace of a goddess and the mind of a tactician. But beneath the surface of ceremony and spectacle was a woman who bore the weight of empire, who faced betrayal and heartbreak with quiet fortitude. Her life was a testament to the complexity of power, not the simple dominion of swords, but the nuanced control of knowledge, perception, and influence. The myths and stories that grew around her were many, each reflecting the culture that told them. To some, she was the enchantress who wielded beauty like a weapon. To others, the scholar queen who preserved knowledge in an age of conquest. To many, she was the symbol of a lost world, a civilization's last breath before the dawn of a new era. yet none captured the fullness of her, neither the ruthless strategist nor the tender mother, neither the sovereign nor the exile, but the woman who held all these contradictions within herself. As centuries passed, Cleopatra's story was retold and reshaped by the hands of poets, historians, and artists, each adding their own hues and shadows. Renaissance painters captured her drama. Victorian novelists explored her passion. Modern scholars sought to disentangle fact from legend. But through all these layers, the core remained. A woman who refused to be erased, who wielded her intellect and identity against overwhelming odds. Her final resting place remains a mystery lost to time, swallowed by the shifting sands or the rising waters of the Mediterranean. Yet perhaps it is fitting that Cleopatra's tomb remains hidden, for her story transcends the physical. It is a legacy etched not in stone alone, but in the enduring questions she poses about power, identity, and the cost of survival, even now. When the desert wind stirs the ancient ruins and the stars cast their cold light upon the land, Cleopatra's presence lingers, an echo in the river's song, a shadow in the flicker of candlelight, a whisper from the pages of history still waiting to be heard anew. History, like the Nile's steady flow, has a way of carrying fragments that drift beneath the surface, hidden from view, yet vital to the shape of what remains above. Cleopatra's life was composed of such fragments, moments of power and vulnerability, alliances forged and broken, love and loss entwined like reeds along the riverbank. To piece them together is to glimpse not only a queen, but a woman whose spirit was both shaped and tested by the currents of her time. Her relationship with Rome was the axis upon which her fate turned. Rome, the rising colossus, with its legions and senators, was a force both feared and courted. Cleopatra navigated this with a sharpness born from necessity, wielding diplomacy as deftly as a sword. Her unions with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not mere liaisons of passion, but deliberate strategies, blending personal alliance with political might. These relationships tethered Egypt's destiny to the vast reaches of Roman ambition, yet also marked her as a figure of contention and intrigue. In Rome's eyes, she was at once exotic and dangerous, a foreign queen whose influence threatened the fragile balance of power. Senators whispered of her seduction, casting her as a temptress who ensnared mighty men, a narrative designed to diminish her intellect and authority. But the truth was far more complex. Cleopatra was a ruler who understood the language of power in every form, who spoke to Caesar and Antony not as a subject, but as an equal, commanding respect through her wisdom, and will dot her political acumen extended beyond these famous alliances. She engaged with kingdoms across the eastern Mediterranean, securing Egypt's borders and trade routes, balancing threats and opportunities with a masterful hand. Her court was a place of learning and culture, a beacon that attracted scholars, artists, and diplomats from distant lands. Alexandria flourished under her reign, its harbors busy with ships carrying spices, papyrus, and knowledge, yet beneath the splendor lay the shadow of conflict. The Battle of Actium was a turning point, a moment when dreams of empire clashed with harsh reality. Cleopatra's choice to retreat, to preserve her fleet and flee toward Egypt, has been debated through the ages, but to her it was a calculated act of survival, not surrender. The tides of war shifted, and with them the fate of two kingdoms. In Alexandria, the siege that followed was both a physical and symbolic battleground. Antony's death, followed by Cleopatra's own choice to embrace death on her own terms, was a final act of defiance. She refused to be paraded as a captive or reduced to a footnote in Rome's history. Instead, she claimed agency in the last breath, sealing her legacy as a sovereign who lived and died by her own will. Her death did not silence her story. Rather, it transformed it. Cleopatra became a symbol, a muse for storytellers across centuries and cultures. Her life inspired works of art, literature, and scholarship, each interpreting her through the lens of their time. She was a queen, a goddess, a lover, a strategist age facet, a reflection of the human experience itself. To remember Cleopatra is to remember the power of identity, the complexity of sovereignty, and the courage to defy the tides that seek to erase us. Her story invites us to look beyond the surface, to hear the whispers beneath history's stone, and to find in her legacy a mirror for our own struggles and triumphs. The echo of Cleopatra's life continues to ripple through the corridors of time, a haunting refrain in the vast symphony of history. Her story is not merely that of a queen who ruled Egypt in its final days as an independent kingdom, but a meditation on power, identity, and the passage of eras. She stood at the crossroads where ancient traditions met the relentless advance of empires, where myth and reality intertwined in the fragile dance of sovereignty and survival. To truly grasp her legacy is to step beyond the confines of fact and fiction, and to listen with reverence to the whispered voices carried by the desert wind, the murmuring Nile, and the shifting sands. Cleopatra was born into a world carved by gods and kings, yet her reign was marked by a profound understanding that the old ways were changing. The lineage of the pharaohs, once divine and absolute, now existed alongside the complex machinations of Roman politics and Mediterranean power struggles. She inherited a kingdom fraught with challenges, internal rivalries, external threats, and the heavy burden of expectation. Yet, from these trials, she forged a path that was uniquely hers, blending intellect, culture, and political acumen in ways that transcended her time. Her relationship with Julius Caesar was a turning point, a meeting of two worlds, one ancient and mystical, the other modern and ruthless. Caesar, captivated not merely by her beauty but by her sharp mind and regal presence, became both ally and protector. Their alliance was a fusion of necessity and strategy, a partnership that shifted the balance of power and altered the course of history. From their union came a son, Caesarion, a living symbol of Egypt's contested future. Following Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra faced a world more perilous than before. The rise of Mark Antony brought both opportunity and danger. Their alliance, a bold attempt to resist Rome's centralizing force. Together, they envisioned a realm that could challenge the Republic's growing dominance, a world where East and West might coexist in a new balance. Their love, legendary and tragic, became intertwined with political destiny, celebrated and condemned in equal measure. The Battle of Actium was not merely a clash of armies, but a collision of visions. Antony and Cleopatra fought not only for territory but for a place in history, for the right to shape their own fate. Their defeat was a profound rupture, a moment when the tide of empire swept away the last vestiges of an era. Yet even in defeat, Cleopatra's resolve remained unbroken. Choosing death over humiliation, she reclaimed sovereignty in the only way left to her, defying those who sought to rewrite her story. Her death marked the end of Egypt's independence, but not the end of her influence. The centuries that followed transformed Cleopatra into a symbol of prism through which cultures projected their fears, desires, and ideals. To Rome, she was the exotic other, a woman whose power was both seductive and threatening. To Egypt, she remained the last pharaoh, a figure of national pride and cultural memory. To later generations, she was muse, myth, and mystery, her life inspiring art, literature, and scholarship across the globe. The search for her tomb has become a metaphor for the human desire to connect with the past, to find meaning in the stories that shape us. Though it remains hidden, her presence endures in the ruins of Alexandria, in the scrolls preserved by scholars, and in the collective imagination of countless peoples. Cleopatra's story reminds us that history is not a fixed narrative, but a living dialogue between past and present, shaped by those who remember and those who seek to understand. In reflecting on Cleopatra's life, we confront questions that resonate across time. What does it mean to wield power? How do identity and culture shape our destiny? What price do we pay for ambition and love? These are not questions with easy answers, but invitations to explore the depths of human experience, as relevant now as they were 2,000 years ago. Her legacy challenges us to look beyond simplistic portrayals and to embrace complexity, the contradictions of strength and vulnerability, wisdom and passion, empire and exile. Cleopatra was neither solely victim nor villain, neither merely queen nor mere myth. She was a woman who navigated the shifting tides of her world with courage and cunning, leaving behind a story that refuses to be forgotten. And so, as the stars wheel overhead and the Nile flows on, her whisper remains soft, persistent, eternal. It calls us to listen, to remember, and to find in her story the enduring truth that history belongs not only to the victors, but to those who dare to shape it with their own hands and hearts. And so, our journey through the life and secrets of Cleopatra comes to an end. But history is never silent. It whispers to those who listen, and it waits for those who dare to return. In our next voyage, we will step into the shadows of the Viking Age, another chapter carved into the stones of time. Until then, may the echoes of the past follow you into your dreams, and may you wake ready for the next legend. Good night.